This is Chambers, and in this video we're going to talk a little bit about organizing your results. So when you do an experiment, you usually end up with all this data in a data table, and in this video we're going to talk about how to organize that. So the problem with data tables is that they don't easily show patterns in data. So if you look at all this data right here in this data table, it shows you some information, but it really doesn't give you a good representation of what's actually happening with the data. If you were to organize that into something that looks like this, now you can see what's really happening. You can see that, for instance, for this product one, it goes up a little bit, then it sharply declines, then it goes back up, and you can see that for all of the data that you collected. So whenever you have data, what you're going to do is do something called a graph, and I'm sure you've heard of graphs before. Graph is basically just a picture of data. And what it does is it helps a researcher to find patterns in the data. There are different types of graphs, and each different type of graph shows different types of data in the best way. So we're going to talk about some different types of graphs here. There are things like bar graphs, there are things like line graphs, you probably heard of pie graphs, and in biology we're going to mostly be doing bar graphs and line graphs, but pie graphs are pretty common also. So let's first start by talking about the line graph, since that's one that you're going to be drawing pretty commonly. What line graphs do is that they show relationships between variables. So if you're trying to see if one variable is changing, if you're trying to see what's happening to the other variable, you're probably going to draw a line graph. It is used when both variables, the independent and the dependent, are what we call quantitative. And quantitative means that they are data in numbers. So for instance, for this graph right here, the data would look something like this. You would have the weeks of practice, which you see over here is on the bottom, and then the words per minute. This graph is about typing speed. And you can see that the weeks were measured in numbers and the words were measured in numbers also. So both data, both the independent and the dependent variable data was numbers, quantitative. So the best graph for this would be a line graph. Line graph help you to track changes over time. So here you can see that over time, this tends to increase. When you have data like this, sometimes you're going to want to actually go dot to dot, but many times you want to draw what's called a best fit line, and it's written right here. A best fit line shows the general trend of the data. It shows in general what is happening with the data. So for instance, you might notice that this point right here and even this point, and actually a lot of the points aren't really falling right on the line. But what this person did was they drew a straight line through most of the data points that shows that in general, this is the shape or the trend that the data happened, that would happen with the data. So if you look here, they kind of in general go up. So we have what's called a direct relationship, meaning that as one increases, the other one increases. The other kind of graph that we're going to draw commonly is a bar graph. And a bar graph is used to compare measurements for different groups. And it's going to look something like this. When you draw a bar graph, the independent variable is usually the name of the group. And so unlike the line graph, which had numbers on both sides, a bar graph is usually going to have something other than numbers on the bottom, on the independent variable. So you can see here it's colors, red, blue, green, black, pink. A pie graph is something completely different. That is used to compare different parts of a whole. So you usually see it drawn as a big circle, and then each part of the pie represents parts of that whole. So the independent variable is usually the name of the part, so in this case it's different kinds of film genres. And then the dependent variable is usually a quantitative measurement, a percentage or a number. So that's when a pie graph is usually used. When you're going to draw a graph, there are some certain rules for setting up the graph. And so I'm going to go through these now. This gives you a good example of all the things that you need when you draw a graph, and I'm going to go through them one by one. So the first thing is you want to make sure you choose the right graph for your data. So you want to make sure, is a bar graph correct? Are you comparing things? Is a line graph correct? Are you trying to see a relationship? Or maybe you need to draw a pie graph. The second thing is you want to make sure that you have the independent variable, and the independent variable is always written on the x-axis. So for this experiment, colors was your independent variable. X-axis is always the bottom of the graph. The dependent variable is always on the y-axis or on the side of the graph. So in this case, it's the number of students. The number of students is your dependent variable. You always want to make sure you include measurements. So if it's measured in centimeters or if it's measured in inches, or if it's times, seconds, you always want to make sure you include that. You want to make sure you have a really good title that describes the data, and we call it a scientific title. And the best way to do this is to use the independent and the dependent variable. So you can say the effect of independent on dependent. So in this case, it would be the effect of colors on the number of students that chose that color. The last two things are you want to make sure you have a uniform scale, which means that you give each box on the graph or each line on the graph a regular value. So you can see here it looks like on the y-axis they went up by, it looks like they went up by 2s, but actually every mark is actually represents 1. So this would be 1, this would be 2, this would be 3, 4, 5, 6. What you usually want to do is use a number that's pretty easy to kind of count up by. So a lot of times 2s are used, or 5s or 10s, because those are pretty easy numbers to count up by. You want to make sure that they're regular intervals. And then the last thing is, if you have a graph that has more than one thing on the graph, especially when it's a line graph, you want to make sure that you have a legend. And it's basically like a key for what the graph is showing you. So you probably want to use different colors or use different symbols and include a clear legend or a key showing you what exactly the graph is talking about. So here's a good example of that. We have two lines on this graph, and the green line represents the year 2005 and the red line represents 2004. So they have a nice little key, a legend over here that describes what this graph is showing you. Now, just real quick, just to kind of show you how a graph should be set up. If you start with a graph, a grid that looks like this, what you want to make sure is you know what your variables are. So in this case, it's what is the effect of always the independent on dependent. And so if we had, for instance, what is the effect of the size of a fish tank on the fish length, when you set up this graph, what you would do is you always put the independent variable on the bottom, the dependent variable on the side. So since we know right here what the independent and the dependent are, you would end up with, on the bottom, size of the fish tank. The independent variable always goes on the bottom. And then fish length would always go on the side. And then you want to make sure that you write a good title that describes your data. And in this case, remember, we always want to do the effect of independent on dependent. So for this data, you would do the effect of size of fish tank, the independent variable, on the fish length, the dependent variable. So that kind of finishes all of our information about graphing. If you have any questions, go ahead and ask your teacher.